very much to everybody for showing up. What I'm going to try to do in the next half an hour or slightly more, try to persuade you of a number of matters which are rather urgent. And perhaps most difficult is to try to persuade you that against the primary currents of thinking which are very influential and dominant. Of course, many of you in Aliran are quite aware of many of these debates, but nonetheless, I think it is useful for us to try to revisit these debates. I'm going to start off, if I may, with my own familiar background. And I have a slideshow which I have prepared, which I hope will be useful for you to follow what I'm going to try to argue. Now, let me try to make sure. Can you see my screen? I've actually done so many of them for some time, but I'm having a bit of difficulty because I took a bit of a break at the end of last year because I felt it's repeating myself all the time. Anyway, here we are. And next, please. Next, please.
Next.
Okay, basically what I'm going to try to do is to run through a bit of economic data to give you a sense of how the world has changed, or at least how Malaysia has changed. And basically in the last couple of decades, we have seen a significant decline in the significance of industry, of manufacturing. And this is should be evident from this particular chart. But you can also sense it from other things. Next, please. In terms of employment, next, please. In terms of employment, you can see how the share of manufacturing has also declined. And services are now quite dominant. They are probably account for almost 60% or 3/5 of the labor force. But what this means is quite obscure, and I'll come to this again later. Next, please. Now, what is also very important and what is significantly understated in this official table is the amount of foreign labor. In 2014, when I was in Rome, the GLCs involved in telecommunications companies did an estimate of the number of foreign workers in this country. And they estimated a total of 6.7 million foreign, and 6.7 million foreign workers is actually quite a lot when you consider that the official data at that time suggested 2.2 million foreign workers. So in other words, we have about 4.5 million foreign workers who are not even being accounted for official data. Now this gives you a sense of how I think that some of the microphones are still on.
Can you mute everybody?
Yeah, some of the
Prof Jomo, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, about a third of Malaysia's labor force is probably foreign, and about a quarter of Malaysia's labor force are undocumented workers. So this is huge. Yeah? This is huge. I mean, of course, you have even higher proportions in places like in the old days of Singapore, but not so many undocumented workers, and in places like the Gulf states and so on. But by the standards of most countries, this is extremely important. And so what this implies is that many Malaysians feel relatively slightly privileged compared to foreign workers. And this, I think, is very important in terms of the shaping of the mind of Malaysians. Next, please. Okay, now what you can see from this data, is an apparent increase in the share of workers' compensation as a proportion of GDP. Now, this has to be looked at against, of course, the rising share of wage earners compared to GDP, and so the data implies that Malaysians are generally getting slightly more than in the past, but this has steadily increased over time. Next, please. Now, taking a longer view from the time of the inauguration of the NEP, you will see that by now, that the vast majority that most sectors of the economy actually have a very high Bumi representation now compared to 1970. The exceptions being slight underrepresentation as far as the so-called managerial class is concerned. Also, a few less in terms of clerical staff, and overrepresentation in agriculture. Now you will see that the Indian share of agriculture, which historically used to be high and again overrepresented, has actually declined very, very significantly, partly due to the changing nature of the plantation labor force. Next, please. So the inter-ethnic average incomes, the ratio is such that, you know, there's been a significant decline since the 1970s, but what these numbers actually are very difficult to tell. If you look at the latest official data, which is in the 12th Malaysia Plan, you will get the impression that Chinese and Malay average incomes are basically on par right now. But this was, and this is a significant change from just 3 years before that in 2016. So I would take some of this data with a pinch of salt, but still it gives you the impression that inter-ethnic average incomes are no longer the kind of issue they used to be once upon a time. Next, please. Now, if we look at the overall distribution of income, you will find that this is the official categorization by what are called B40, M40, and T20. But I would suggest to you that to pay some attention to a KRI study by some of my colleagues, led by Hawati Hamid, and she basically, together with her colleagues, they basically suggested that the bottom 20%, of the Malaysian labor force basically has a very, very tough time making ends meet. Okay, to use the Malay expression, kais pagi, makan pagi, and so on and so forth. But for the next 50%, yeah, they basically can make ends meet, but they don't live in luxury. They are not able to save significantly. And it is only the top 30% who are able to partake of some luxuries and or save a little bit of money. So when we talk about these categories of B40 and so on and so forth, I think we should recognize that they were only introduced about a decade ago during the Najib regime, and largely at the behest of the World Bank. And it's really not very meaningful to talk about 20, 40, 40 and as a universal categorization is really not very helpful for us to try to better understand the challenges which we face in our societies. Now, of that top 30%, of course, that in itself does not tell us very much in terms of the further breakdown. And I would like to suggest to you that we actually underestimate both income and wealth inequality in this country, because a great deal of the wealth of the richest people in the country is actually salted away abroad. Abroad can be as close as Singapore, it can be Hong Kong, it can be Australia, it can be London, wherever. It is not by accident that the largest number of people outside of the Americas who had accounts in Panama were actually Malaysians. It's not an accident that the owner of the most expensive property sold in the 21st century in the United States happens to be a Malaysian prince, and so on and so forth. So I think one needs to recognize that that for a rentier elite, and I'll come back to this issue later, for them, it's not, they don't necessarily make their money by investments, okay, like ordinary folks. Okay, they make their money because of the connections they have and a whole variety of other things. And so there's no incentive to keep their money in the country. And so the fact that Malaysia is such an open economy gives huge opportunities for the elite to take its money out of the country. So we have a situation comparable, for example, to Marcos before his downfall, and continues in countries like the Philippines, which continue to be very open economies. And different from, say, let us say Indonesia, where the elite, people like Suharto and Lim Swee Leong and so on and so forth, actually saw it in their interest to reinvest in the Indonesian economy. So you can have two dictators running two island republics with very, very different outcomes. One economy, like the Indonesian economy, growing at about 8% during the high growth period, and the other economy, like the Philippines economy, growing only at about 3% during the high growth period for the so-called MIT economies, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. Next, please. Okay, so Malaysia is really, when most Malaysians talk about the NEP, they are actually referring to the share ownership, right? And that's what the elite's interests are in. And you can see that there has been a significant decline, that there has been a significant increase in Malaysian share ownership after 1970. And there has been a significant decline in Malaysian ownership of stocks and shares in the last decade or so. This is really quite a phenomenon, because we now have a situation where almost half the share capital in this country is actually owned by foreigners. Okay, and conversely, I'm sure many Malaysians own stocks and shares in every other economy, and they feel much more secure about that. Their property rights are far more secure, and so on and so forth. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, I included this table just to give you a sense that Mahathir's policy introduced in the early 1980s of privatization and emphasizing private entrepreneurship rather than the role of the state, which was very important during the Razak and Hussein On years, basically has succeeded. And you can find that, for example, Bumiputra individuals actually own a significant share of the total Bumiputra capital, whereas organizations such as PNB are actually far less significant. But if you look at, for example, the distribution of shares of Amanah Saham, Bumiputra, and so on and so forth, or let us say Tabung Haji, you will see again a tremendous concentration of ownership. Next, please. Okay, this basically reminds us that the poverty rate in Malaysia official poverty rate in Malaysia has actually gone down very, very significantly. But the Gini ratio has also, I want to emphasize, declined. Not very much, but it has declined significantly enough for us to recognize that this has been happening. From over almost 50% at one stage, down to about just under 40% or about 40% at currently. Next, please. If we look at the poverty rates, you will see some confusing numbers for the total and so on and so forth. The reason why for this confusion is because slightly over a decade ago, the Malaysian government changed its definition slightly, and more recently, after the Philip Alston visit and the report, it changed its definition again. So the result of the second change in the definition is actually a significant increase in the measure of poverty. But you have to recognize that a lot of these measures are still essentially arbitrary and subjective. They are to some extent consistent with the official, with the international definition. But the international definition, I want to emphasize, has not really changed. The so-called $a-day definition, which the World Bank arbitrarily introduced over 2 decades ago, it has really not really changed very much. And so some of us have spent a lot of time challenging that data, and I think many people now agree, including the last Inquasis professor who used to be in charge of World Bank data, basically agrees that there is a certain arbitrariness and there's a certain underestimation because of the methodology used. Next, please. Now, this basically reminds us that we've, for a decade now, a so-called minimum wage, okay? And this minimum wage is, one always has to acknowledge, it is the result of struggles for decades and decades, okay? Labor groups, as well as others who are sympathetic to labor, have been supporting this struggle for a minimum wage. But the minimum wage has hardly moved. And it was introduced at about a decade ago at about 900 for Semenanjung, even lower for Sabah and Sarawak, even though most people would agree that the cost of living in Sabah and Sarawak are generally higher. And so you have had that, and then it was raised about 4 years later, and then again about two years following that, after the election. But otherwise, you have actually seen little movement. And the recent governments have actually said that they have no intention of doing very much with the minimum wage. To the disappointment of many people, of course, the Pakatan Harapan did not deliver on its promise of significantly increasing the minimum wage. So I think we have to recognize that this is a very much unfinished struggle. But I think one also needs to recognize that you cannot simply have a massive increase in the minimum wage without significant adjustments because of the kind of disruption of the economy. This economy has become addicted to low wages, and employers have become very used to low wages. And a simple change in that policy can, of course, be hugely problematic. Next, please. Next, please. Thank you. Okay, this gives you an idea of how much when we talk about fiscal incidents or tax incidents, basically we are talking about how much people pay in taxes. And on the one hand, it has to be said that most Malaysians in the lower income group do not pay taxes, do not pay direct taxes. They pay essentially indirect taxes, previously in the form of SST and then in the form of GST, which is likely to be restored by whatever change of government takes place after the next general election. Now, this shift of the declining significance and contribution of personal income tax begins from the mid-1980s. Okay, the 1980 budget was the first time there was a significant decline in middle income tax. My former colleague, the late Ismail Saleh, pointed out in his PhD thesis work, which covered the late 60s and the 70s, that Malaysian tax incidence, that means the impact of tax on households, has been regressive even in those days. Regressive meaning it doesn't play a Robin Hood role, it plays a reverse Robin Hood role. It was that way in the late 1960s and continued in the 1970s. Wee Chong Hui from Kuching has shown that this has continued at least until the last decade. If we look at government spending, unfortunately, there isn't very much work done in this country. The main work on this was done almost 4 decades ago by a man named Jacob Meerman. And you basically see that government expenditure as well was not progressive. In other words, we always like to think that government spending favors the less well-off and so on and so forth. That is not the case. It is a myth. And basically, I think it's very important for us to recognize that what Najib did was actually quite brilliant from a political point of view. He actually reduced subsidies for the low-income groups in many ways, but in 2 main ways. One, by getting rid of a lot of subsidies, subsidies for goods and so on and so forth, and increasing and giving and introducing BRIM. Okay, so BRIM reaches people in a personal way, and so they feel appreciative of getting that BRIM. And I think this is very important because if you think about the first president of Aliran, Chandra Muzaffar's work, the whole idea of a protector, this reinforces the idea of the state as protector. And if you think about Francis Lowe's own work, looking at the impact of development expenditure and how development has become part of the ideology of the ruling ideology over the years. This is very important for us to recognize. Next, please. Okay, here you can see that the actual amount of subsidies and social assistance has almost halved. Yeah, since but by now it has almost halved. It has halved compared to almost a decade ago. Okay, but what we see, and this is part of the reason why we have to understand that why the last the Pakatan Harapan finance minister was extremely unpopular. The subsidies for let us say fishermen, they were being used for political patronage undoubtedly, but by taking away those subsidies, it was very easy for others to say that this is what you can expect when the Pakatan Harapan comes to power, or worse still, when the DAP rules. Okay, so you can see how political attitudes are shaped very much by subsidies and social assistance and so on and so forth. And this, I think, is very important for us to recognize. Next, please. Okay, this is actually work by Lee Hock An. Okay, it's published by ICS in Singapore. Yusof Ishak was actually born in Matang in Perak, but later became the first president of an independent Singapore. And basically, it is very, in many of the people, in the rhetoric of many people who criticize the government, they often claim that the NEP actually widened Bumiputra inequality. But the evidence is actually poor for that. In fact, Hock An even suggests that income inequality has declined, although I would qualify that because he's just looking at official data without recognizing what lies behind that data. But still, I think it is very important for us to recognize that this claim that Bumiputra inequality has increased because of the NEP is a false claim. And this, I think, is very important for us to recognize. Next, please. Okay, now here again, you have a similar thing. I'm sorry, my slides are slightly out of whack, but you can see that the huge expansion in tertiary education opportunities in the last few decades has mainly offered gains to the Bumiputra population. And this, again, I think is very important for us to recognize why many people, despite all its failings and problems, PTPTN is seen as contributing to urban mobility. And he suggests, I disagree that it contributed to declining overall inequality. So if you think back to about the NEP period, in 1970, basically only 1% of the population of the country of any age cohort reaching of university age in 1970, only 1% actually went to university. The current share, at least before the pandemic, was closer to 30%. Okay, so you can see how expectations have changed and so on and so forth. Let's not get into a discussion about the question of quality, whether it really contributes to productivity and so on and so forth. But these are very, very important facts for us to consider. Next, please. Okay, the unemployment figures. Okay, again, I think there was undoubtedly an increase in unemployment during 2021, but the big increase you can see is in the second quarter of 2020, and basically it has been largely contained if official numbers are to be believed. I have a great deal of doubt about official numbers, but I think it is not inaccurate. I'll come back to this question in a moment. Next, please. Okay, I think, although many of us have made a lot of criticisms about the way money has been spent, and I would add the criticism of where the money has come from. The fact of the matter remains that some of the worst consequences of the pandemic have actually been mitigated. Okay, so many people might have criticisms about my this and my that, but in effect there was actually some benefits which have affected a great number of people. There are many problems with the way the Malaysian government and the way the public was mobilized in response to the crisis, to the pandemic. But I think it would be a mistake not to acknowledge the kind of partial success which the government has achieved through the various spending measures, largely associated, of course, with the previous Prime Minister Mahyudin. Next, please. Okay. Next, please. Okay. Now I think basically I want to emphasize that we almost within years, within half a decade of pronouncing the East Asian miracle in 1993, the miracle came to an end after 1997. And I think that also brought an end to deindustrialization. But I want to emphasize that the devastation in terms of deindustrialization in Malaysia and arguably in the rest of Southeast Asia is much more serious. But I would argue Malaysia is the worst case, even compared to Thailand and Indonesia, because Malaysia really has no serious captains of industry. You know, when you think about the captains of industry, we do not have any significant industrial entrepreneurs to speak of. Whatever still exists is but through the state, and even then it has been severely constrained during especially in the post-Mahathir period. So what we have then is industrial stagnation, and Najib tried to make a virtue out of a necessity by claiming that, oh, we are graduating from secondary development to tertiary development. We are no longer talking about manufacturing, we're going to services. But if you look carefully at what services services employment was developed, you will find that in fact, most of the services employment which developed during this period was actually employment in the, how should I put it, employment in government services was very important. When Mahathir stepped down, there were 850,000 people in public services, and by 2018 or 2017 rather, there were 1.7 million. Okay, almost double the number of people in, and of course, before every election, there were significant perks given to the civil servants to basically ensure, basically vote buying, to put it rather bluntly. So the result of all this, of course, has been to secure a continuing vote bank, if you will, for the government. And then at the same time, you have a continued reliance on cheap labor. And that continued reliance on cheap labor is ensured by the presence not only of foreign labor, but of cheap foreign labor, particularly cheap foreign labor in the form of the undocumented foreign workers. So there are sectors of the economy right now where if you talk about the expulsion of the foreign workers, you're actually cutting off your nose to spite your face, because there are certainly much of agriculture will not survive without the foreign workers. Much of construction will not survive without foreign workers. And there are a number of other sectors as well, including petty trades and so on and so forth, which are very, very dependent on this. So I think what we have is a situation where we are under a lot of delusions. The public is under a lot of delusions, but we are not talking about a common shared consciousness about what is happening in society. And what is actually happening, I would suggest, is that many people have got great faith in the state, and especially among the Bumiputras, and but that the state is actually taking them for a ride. And this has unfortunately been a reality for a long time, but has become much more pronounced in the early 21st century. So there is no progressive redistribution, contrary, as I tried to show in the fiscal discussion, and there is there's no source of dynamism for the future in terms of industrial policy and so on. We are not going to become a Korea. We are not going to become a Singapore even. Okay, for a whole number of reasons which we can talk about later. Next, please. So I just want to emphasize 2 or 3 things which are not strictly economic, but which are important for us to recognize: the changing character of Malaysian society. When this country got independence, over 90% of the population was in the countryside. Today, less than 20% are in the countryside. The reason I say less than 20%, although the official figures suggest otherwise, is because a lot of people live in peri-urban areas because they are cheaper to live in. So those of you who study things like Terry Becky's Desa Kota and so on and so forth, this is the reality. I mean, almost the entire Klang Valley conurbation is basically, peri-urban. If it's not urban, it's peri-urban. likewise with much of southern Johor, likewise with Seberang Perai and much of Penang Island. Next, please. Now, also the character of society. Today, we now have a situation where over three-quarters of the population are actually wage earners. But you do not have a population which sees themselves as wage earners. They do not see themselves as working class. They have all kinds of other affiliations which are important to them. And this has been encouraged by what we now call identity politics, but this has been going on for a long time. And the share of people who are basically unpaid family labor is very, very small. And it's, but it's still there. Yeah, it's still there. And so what we call the middle class, many of them are self-employed or employers. So we are talking about 20% of the population. And earlier I mentioned that 30%, so that 30% would probably include some part of the salariat as well. Yeah, whether government or private sector. Next, please. So where does all this lead us? I think although we have a population, not only but especially among the Malay population. Yeah? I'm speaking less about the Bumiputras of Sabah and Sarawak here, which is basically urban working class. There is no corresponding social consciousness of this, and certainly not much political representation of this. And this is due to a variety of factors, which I'm sure you all talk about yourselves, but I think it's important for us to recognize as part of the reality. I already mentioned the significance of the foreign worker presence, and I think it is important to recognize how the so-called Malaysian economic model or development model continues to be reliant on cheap labor. And we have and any significantly progressive social policies are very unlikely. Let's face it, in the world today, they are also it's very, very exceptional. The southern cone of Latin America, there's some progress occasionally, fits and starts, but in much of the rest of the world, there are very few significant progressive advances as far as social policy is concerned. On the contrary, what we have seen, especially since the late 20th century and especially since the beginning of this century, we have seen the rise of what I sometimes term ethno-populism, and these reinforce the divisiveness of certain types of ethnic identity politics and frustrates the possibility of much more pragmatic national development policies. Next, please. Next, sorry, yeah, here we are. Okay, this is my last slide, thank goodness. Okay, here we have a situation where I think it is very important, and those of you who are in Aliran probably know this, but let's face it, okay? People who think about these issues in Aliran are a very, very small minority of the middle class. The middle class is largely dominated by varieties of liberal thinking. Okay, you have the right-wing libertarians represented by people like Ideas and so on, which offer a right-wing libertarian alternative and basically would like to go back to sort of a particular view of where development comes from. It's a very oversimplified, and in fact, I would suggest, I'll put it to you, is actually a distorted view of what reality is like. But it ignores the reality of the last 7 decades, I would suggest. The 7 decades that ever since the emergency, we have had a society where the only legitimate politics which has been encouraged by the state, the colonial state and the post-colonial state, have been varieties of ethno-populism. There are, of course, varieties of ethno-populism which are circumscribed, which are discouraged by the state. For example, when the DAP challenges the MCA and so on and so forth. But by and large, ethno-populism is largely tolerated, if not even, is not even encouraged by the very nature of the Barisan Nasional. And I would put it to you that we have very interesting new phenomena. Well, not entirely new, going back to Stephen Kalong Ningkan and so on. You have this, it goes back much, much further as far as Sabah and Sarawak are concerned. But we have a real problem of having to deal with the difficulties of ethno-populism and the inability to develop a kind of a progressive nationalist populist coalition as an alternative. This is the big problem, the big challenge for Malaysia. And there was the hope about a decade and a half ago that this might emerge, in the aftermath of the Anwar resurgence and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, has not really happened. Now, I suggest that there's likely to be an early general election. My own hunch at this point, although things can change almost daily now, my own hunch is that Najib has got very few constraints. It's almost a do or die kind of campaign for him right now in Johor. And after the Johor election, he and his forces will try to move for an early election. The advantage of an early election, of course, is that many of the deals which were struck between Perikatan Nasional and Pakatan Harapan can be ignored. In Johor, we know that there are at least 3 cornered fights, if not more, and this is likely to be the scenario come the general election, which will basically pave the way for Najib to make a grand comeback, even comparable, some people would argue, to 2004, when people were happy to see the Mahathir go, and they welcomed Patla in a big way. So I would put it to you that right now it's a very complicated situation. There are so many problems to deal with, but I would suggest that we need to unite to return against the return of a grand coalition of the Barisan Nasional coalition, of the grand corruption associated with it. It's very, very powerful. They prove themselves in Malacca, and it's very likely that they will be able to do likewise in Johor. And they have forged a lot of coalitions which are not in the public eye, but which are very important. So the kind of carte blanche you're going to get from such a win is going to be worse, I would argue, than the status quo before May 2018. So I think we have to brace ourselves, and people are not going to like working with people whom they have made enemies of over the last decade or so. But there is desperately a need for that. Of course, one can talk about the importance of new political discourses, new institutions, and so on and so forth. Things need to get worse before they get better, and so on and so forth. I think some of the older ones around here have seen enough of that, and know that unfortunately things don't work that way. So I think it's important for us to explore the consequences thereof, and for us to have a discussion tonight, perhaps over the remaining hour which we have, on what this might envisage, this might involve. So let me stop here. Let me thank Aliran again for this. It's the first time I've been invited, I think, since to an Aliran event since the mid-1980s, I think. and very, very different circumstances. Yeah, as these Portuguese and Latin slogan suggests, the struggle continues and we have to seize the time. Thank you very much again.